Pass it over to you, Dr. Walker. Thank you so much for being here.
Great. Thank you so much, Jess, for this invitation. It's truly an honor to be here with everyone tonight. It's great to see all this interest. And I'm very excited to share with you a little bit about the kingdom of fungi. So this is an entirely separate group of organisms, not plants, not animals, but they're their own kingdom of life. And we are, as you know, in the presence of abundance of mushrooms here in Nova Scotia, especially this year with all the rainfall. So I'm going to talk to you about, of course, what many of us are interested in, which are edible and poisonous mushrooms in Nova Scotia, but also some ways that you can get involved in helping us document the species that we have right here in our backyards, because there are an incredible number of species that we don't even know about. They may not have names yet. We have cryptic species, which means there may be 4 things that look the same, but they're genetically different. And thanks to apps like iNaturalist and tools like DNA sequencing, we can use citizen science to start documenting this diversity. Okay, so I'm at Acadia University here in Wolfville, where we also have a wonderful herbarium collection of 20,000 dried mushroom specimens and many more plants, algae, and lichens. And if you're ever in Wolfville, I'm happy to give you a tour. And it's a big resource for biodiversity in our area. So you may have heard a bit about this ongoing diversity project we had this summer. It's part of the Continental Mycoblitz. And I'll get back to this a bit later in the talk, but it received CBC coverage, and we were doing this in partnership with the Museum of Natural History in Halifax, the New Brunswick Museum in St. John, and a group in Prince Edward Island as part of a continent-wide North American mycoblitz, meaning over a defined period of time, anyone who's interested can go out and take pictures of mushrooms in their backyard and their favorite hiking trails and submit them to our project on iNaturalist, which if you're not familiar, it's a great way to share observations of birds, other animals, plants, and fungi. And there is a community of skilled naturalists and others who can help identify what you find. So for this project, we are looking for photos, which is great, but also even the mushrooms themselves can be submitted at the museum in Halifax or to me here at Acadia. So we ran this in the summer, just wrapped up, but we're going to do another one in October, which is why I'm telling everyone about this. And our goal is really to document at least 1,000 different species of mushrooms for the Maritimes, if we can. We suspect there may be 3,000 different species here. But this is our target, and this is, again, going on across North America. So there's never been anything like this historically, this many people looking at mushrooms, at the same time, documenting them for science. And it's a way that families, anybody can get out there and get involved. Okay, so this is just showing a snapshot. I literally took this a couple minutes ago of where we're at with our summer data. And you can see across North America on the left, we have over 12,000 observations, so photos of different mushrooms across North America submitted by 364 people. And this represents about 1,400 different species of mushrooms, which is pretty incredible. And again, this was run over 10 days in August. And you can explore the data. You can zoom in on your favorite area and see what has been found around you. I'm showing here the stats for Nova Scotia. We had a friendly rivalry going on with New Brunswick, and I'm proud to say we had more observations. We have 458 different mushrooms. Again, most of these were photos, but we do have over 100 dried specimens that were submitted by 35 observers. So we had even more people doing this than I did in New Brunswick. Not that it's all about competition, but it's just a lot of fun to see the numbers roll in and the specimens roll in. And so what we found so far is 123 species of different mushrooms in Nova Scotia. And you can see on the map where people were sending in their photos and mushrooms from. So really exciting to have this type of information at our fingertips now, thanks to iNaturalist and projects like this. If you're interested, again, I'll give more information a bit later, but you can go on iNaturalist and you can explore our Summer Continental Mycoblitz project, and you can sign up for our Fall Mycoblitz project as well. And really, you can explore data all over North America. Okay. So I do have to back up and zoom out a bit to tell everyone a little bit about wild mushroom collecting, because many folks are interested in this. So in addition to biodiversity, of course, mushrooms have medicinal and nutritional properties that have fascinated humans for centuries. And we know that annual mushroom production can be on the order of kilograms per hectare in terms of edible mushrooms in certain parts of the world. And it can be a huge economic contributor as well in certain areas. And here's King Charles. It's also a mushroom forager. And it's, practiced all over the world. Different backgrounds, different sets of knowledge have led people to use mushrooms, for cooking and nutrition. We know that every time you go out, you're taking a risk if you don't know what you're doing. So we do want to stress the importance of that as well. Okay. And why do we have so many beautiful mushrooms in Nova Scotia? We have an incredible diversity of soil types, and with that comes different vegetation types and habitats, allowing us to explore regions like Cape Breton Highlands, old growth forests, coastal plains and sand dunes, hardwood forests. And with this comes a big diversity of fungi as well. So many are decomposers of organic matter and plants, and some form important partnerships with plant roots as well, or even with animals. So the last comprehensive list for Nova Scotia was done in 2011. 350 mushrooms were documented. We know that there are thousands more, maybe 3,000 different mushrooms present in the Maritimes. And this mycoblitz is letting us get more of a handle on that. So back to the inherent risks. We don't have a lot of data on the poisonings per year, but there are, as we'll learn about today, a few mushrooms that, if consumed, can be fatal, even at a very small amount. So foraging for mushrooms is a serious matter, and you need to be in the company of skilled folks who've done this before. We're going to talk about the Nova Scotia Mycological Society, which is hosting a foray this year near Canning. So going out with groups like that who have the expertise is a great way to learn about edible and poisonous mushrooms. And one associated risk is mushrooms that are eaten in Europe, for example, may look very similar to related fungi here, but they may contain different toxins. So certain rules of thumb from other countries don't always apply to North American fungi, which are less well known. So unfortunately, there are no shortcuts or general rules to easily know which mushrooms are edible and poisonous. So how do we go about starting to learn which is which? Okay, you need to know the basics of mushroom anatomy, so the different parts of the mushroom and what that can tell us about their identity. We need to use knowledgeable field guides. And a caveat here is recently I learned there are fake field guides available on Amazon that are made by AI. So these are actually quite dangerous. They're not accurate, and they can lead to mushroom poisonings. So you really need to get a reliable field guide. And if you check out our Nova Scotia Mycological Society website, we do have a list of good books for our region. I mentioned the importance of learning from experts, joining local clubs, never taking any chances with edible fungi. When in doubt, simply throw it out. So here are some of our basic anatomical features of a mushroom. And we see a mushroom in the forest. Of course, it is just like the apple on a tree. It's not the whole organism. So when you're picking a mushroom, it's like the fruit of that larger unseen mycelium that's often underground. When you're taking pictures, for example, if you want to add them to iNaturalist, you want to get pictures from different angles. And a really important part is under the cap of the mushroom. And you may have noticed that some have gills, the agarics, and others have pores, which is the boletes and polypores. So that's kind of a first way to classify them and separate them, is looking under the cap. And these gills, of course, are where the spores are produced. If you want to make spore prints to further identify your mushrooms, you would cut off the cap, put it on a piece of black or white paper, and wait overnight to see what color spores are dropped by the mushroom. On the stem or stipe of the mushroom, you might find a ring or annulus. It's a remnant of a veil that was protecting those gills and spores as they developed. Okay, and at the bottom, if you dig down, it's really important to actually dig beneath the surface of the soil to see if there's a cup or any other features at the base of the stem that might get overlooked if you were to just snap it off at the soil level. So ideally, you want to get different stages, different growth forms of the same mushroom to really figure out what it is. Because, for example, if it's not mature, it might not be producing spores to make a spore print. An immature Amanita mushroom looks a lot like a little white puffball. So there can be mistakes made if you are not looking at a full mature mushroom, or if, say, it's too old and eaten by bugs. Bolete mushrooms, on the other hand, have pores where they produce their spores instead of gills. So these are just the basics of starting to look really closely at mushrooms. We're interested in the size, the shape, and the color of the mushroom, as well as the smell. Some people like to do a little taste and spit it out to see, particularly with boletes, if it's bitter. But again, you always want to spit it out. And you want to make a note of the habitat or where you found your mushroom. What types of trees or plants are around it? What time of year are you finding it? Okay, so all of this is really important. Is it growing on wood? Is it growing out of soil? And things like that. Now here's some beautiful images of the spore prints that I mentioned. You can see the dark spores of a portobello mushroom or agaricus there, and white spores in contrast by maybe a russula or a lactarius mushroom. Now, to really get to know some mushrooms, you have to study their spores under the microscope, because the spores can be just as diverse and beautiful as the mushrooms themselves. So here's an example of 3 different mushrooms and just really different spores. And these would be tiny, microns in length. They have their own textures, colors, and shapes that we document as well. And of course, the spores are for dispersal to create new mushrooms in other places, and often are transported by wind, water, or animals. You can see how there are lookalikes. Again, when in doubt, leave it alone. You see a smaller, pointy, conical, edible morel mushroom here, the darker one, and then you see the false morel next to it, which is kind of more amorphous and blobby, kind of bigger brain kind of structure. And both of these appear early in the spring. Morels are not super common in Nova Scotia, but sometimes people are just so excited to see the first living things in the spring, or the first fungi, that they may want to eat the false morels. Some people do eat them and boil them up, which does remove a toxin that they contain, but it's still not advised as an edible species. So getting to know not only the edible fungi, but also the lookalikes in your area is super important. So I'll use a few icons throughout my talk to help you remember some of these edibles and nasty fungi. Okay, so there's the edibles, the poisonous, the ones that won't kill you but might make you wish you were dead for a while, and then those are the gastrointestinal irritants, right? So just diarrhea and vomiting are a common side effect, right? There are only a few mushrooms that would actually kill you. Then we'll use these icons to indicate if a mushroom has a mycorrhizal partnership with a tree. So if you know the tree that it partners with, that can help you find that particular mushroom. Many more mushrooms are decomposers, also called saprophytic here on wood. Okay, so this is just telling us a bit about where that fungus gets its nutrition from. Again, the mushrooms being the fruit of the larger fungus. Now, this has been an incredible year for chanterelles. It's many people's favorite edible mushroom in Nova Scotia, Cantharellus, and there are many different species here to enjoy. They're pretty distinctive and a good one to start to learn as a beginner, because they have these ridges instead of true gills, and these ridges go partway down the stipe. They also are fairly long-lasting in the field. They're not as easily eaten by bugs and slugs as some of the other mushrooms. And they have that kind of vase-shaped to them as well. Okay, when fresh, some of them have kind of a fruity apricot odor. Can be quite common in our spruce and fir forests, but also can associate with a wide variety of hardwoods as well. Very popular edible mushroom worldwide. Okay, as we know, they dry well. They're used in soups. It can be sauteed and frozen, and just a really beautiful mushroom that we have here. Some of you may have also seen some of the Craterellus chanterelles, which is a different genus, but also edible. We have our flame chanterelles and our winter chanterelles here. And we also, if you're lucky, you may find a black chanterelle with oak or beech. So again, they have slightly different habitat preferences, but you can see they're related because they have this deep vase shape to them. It's quite different from your typical mushroom shape. But there are lookalikes. So the fall chanterelle, or Hygrophorapsis, can be poisonous and is often found on wood. So that's a big difference. For a true morel would be mycorrhizal with this underground relationship with plant roots. This particular lookalike, although it's the same color, it's a wood decomposer. So you might see it growing out of a log or in a big cluster. And you can see it's a bit different. It doesn't have quite that deep vase shape, and it doesn't have those big ridges that go all the way down. Like it looks a little bit like that, but it's not quite the same. So after a while, you start to be able to differentiate those. It is eaten in Mexico, but it's not recommended as an edible mushroom. And it's always a good idea to cut mushrooms in half and just always ensure that you have a fresh specimen. And just again, looking for differences in shape, hollow versus dense, just different structural differences can help you tell these apart. You can see that the Cantharellus has a much wider stem as well. Another one that is rare in Nova Scotia, but you might be fortunate enough to find it sometimes, and it can be mistaken for chanterelles. It's often much bigger. Again, it's growing out of wood, and this is the jack-o'-lantern mushroom, Omphalodus alludens, which is also bioluminescent, meaning it contains luciferin, just like fireflies and some types of animals and algae, which is this bioluminescent pigment. And we're not sure why this mushroom has this ability, maybe to attract moths or some kind of dispersers that are active at night, but really a fascinating orange mushroom that does glow in the dark. And it grows right here in Nova Scotia. I've even seen them once in Wolfville. So they might look like they're coming out of the soil, but if you dig deeper, you'll see they're actually always on wood. And they will also give you a stomach ache and gastro symptoms, but completely beautiful. If you're like me, you might really love the hydnums. These are hedgehog mushrooms, which in terms of edibility, they taste a little bit to me like chanterelles. They have that same kind of meaty texture, and they're a good one for beginners as well because they have teeth underneath. They're quite distinctive. They don't have pores or gills under the cap, but instead they have these fascinating teeth. So they're related to chanterelles, and we have a few different species here. A new one was just described very recently from New Brunswick, Hydnum atlanticum. So we have more than 2 species. Again, example of cryptic species. We have a smaller one called the depressed hedgehog. It's kind of a sad name, but it's because of the depression in the center of the cap, and the larger classic Hydnum or pandum, which is found with hardwoods. So again, these are often found in really large numbers, big patches. So another edible mushroom, again, kind of an orangey color, is our Lactarius. Here we have many different Lactarius in the province, but this one, you can see it stains kind of greenish, and it's in the genus Lactarius, which produce kind of a milk. They're called the milky caps, and it's a latex substance that comes out of the gills once they're cut. So this is a key feature of this group of mushrooms, and these are also mycorrhizal with tree roots, and they have a white spore print. Okay, and so these ones with spruce and fir is, again, if you know the mycorrhizal partner, the tree, that can help you when you're looking for this particular mushroom to go into that type of habitat, you're more likely to find it. So the mushroom is providing access to water in the soil for the tree, as well as nitrogen and phosphorus, and in exchange for sugars, that the tree is producing through photosynthesis. So a quick way to tell if you have a lactarius, again, is to break the gills and see if any kind of milky substance comes out of them. Here's an example of the white spore print, and then a closer look at what I mean by this latex that comes out. And again, this is most easily observed when they're fresh. You might not see it in an older specimen. We have many different colors and species of lactarius here in the Maritimes. We also have their relatives in the genus Rusula. So these look quite similar, but they don't produce that latex, and they're called the brittle-gilled mushrooms. It's their common name. So you've probably seen these around as well. Again, making a white spore print. The classic red one here with the white stipe, Rusula emetica group, is also known as the sickener, so it does cause gastrointestinal upset. So both of these groups, Lactarius, milky caps, and the Rusula brittle gills, are members of the same family, the Rusulaceae. And other than Lactarius deliciosus, which I showed you in the first slide, generally not known as being a big group of edible mushrooms. Okay, but really just beautiful examples of biodiversity. And we talked a bit about how mushrooms help trees in the forest. They're also a food source for small mammals, insects, and bacteria, other fungi. So they are a big source of nutrition themselves in the forest too. You can see some of them produce kind of interesting mucus and different substances that may attract insects to disperse the spores of the mushrooms. So one of our favorites here in the Maritimes, and it's actually on our logo of our Mycological Society, is the lobster mushroom. And this is a perfect one, of course, for Nova Scotia. And it's actually two fungi in one, because it's a orangey red mold, a hypomyces mold that's growing on top of a white mushroom. And the mushroom can be a Rusula or a Lactarius mushroom. So it's a moldy mushroom that is a prized edible only when it has both of these fungi present, the mold and the white mushroom. So it has kind of a shellfish aroma and flavor. Not everyone likes that in a mushroom, but some people find it quite delicious. And again, the white mushroom is a mycorrhizal species. So it's partnered with a tree, and then it's been colonized by this red mold. So the white mushrooms are typically Rusula brevipes or Lactarius piperatus, and on their own, they're nothing special. They're not considered choice edible mushrooms. In fact, the Lactarius is kind of hot tasting, like black pepper, hence the name. But when it's colonized by this red mold, this hot, spicy flavor has been neutralized by this parasitic mold. And it actually changes the texture of the mushroom, makes it less brittle and crumbly, and makes it into a better edible. You can grow this red mold in a petri dish, and you can inoculate it and try to create your own lobster mushrooms if you so desire. So quite an interesting relationship, and not your typical mushroom. Now you may have seen these shaggy mane mushrooms growing in your lawn. They look big, open, grassy areas. They look kind of like giant Q-tips. And another nickname for them is inky caps or lawyer's wigs. And so they, when fresh, can be a good edible mushroom. They produce dark spore prints, like what I've shown here, but you really have to get them kind of the day that they emerge. Which leads me to another question that people ask, which is, how do mushrooms appear literally overnight? It's because they're 90% water. And so when it rains, there's a tiny little primordia or little egg shape mushroom in the soil, and it's going to absorb the rainwater and then grow because they're 90% water. So they literally burst out of nowhere. And that's, I think, what always I found interesting as a kid was how these mushrooms would appear out of nowhere. So shaggy manes are really good for that. But if you get them too late, they look really horrifying because they literally autodigest. They start to liquefy and their gills turn into a black ink. Okay, so we call it deliquescence, and it's another spore dispersal mechanism. So it's making itself more attractive to insect dispersers. It's curling back its gills and cap, and just becoming a big pile of black sticky goo, which is all part of the plan to disperse this mushroom. So you can see not a tasty edible by this point. Okay, it's related to a fascinating mushroom called Coprinopsis, or Tippler's bane, formerly known as Coprinus atramentarius. And you can see a similar shape. Tippler's bane, now this one has an interesting story because it's a fine edible mushroom unless you're drinking alcohol, in which case you're going to feel very, very sick. So it contains an amino acid called caprine. And what this means is if you've had a drink between 3 hours prior to 5 days after you eat this mushroom, you're going to have a temporary toxicity, which kind of feels a bit like gangrene, like tingling limbs, agitation, heart palpitations, nausea, vomiting. And again, it can be as little as 3 ounces of beer that can bring this on. Okay, so it's an interaction of the alcohol and this caprine amino acid. So not a good edible mushroom to have at a meal where alcohol is served. And how does this work? It's because in your liver, this caprine from the mushroom is blocking the enzyme your body typically uses to break down alcohol. So it's causing a buildup of this intermediate product, acetaldehyde, which is toxic. Right? So it's interfering with your body's natural breakdown of alcohol in the liver. Incidentally, it's the same mechanism that a drug called antabuse uses, and that's used to treat alcoholism because it makes the experience of drinking alcohol an extremely unpleasant experience. So this kind of hints at the complex chemical diversity that mushrooms can contain. In addition to the biological diversity, they produce a wealth of interesting chemical compounds, and some of them are quite toxic. I should also add, you might see a squirrel or another animal eating a mushroom. It doesn't mean that you can also eat the same mushroom. Some of the effects are quite different on other animals. Here are some of the many, many different boletes that we have in the province. These are the mushrooms with pores under the cap, not gills. It's a soft, spongy, sporulating surface. These are actually tubes that are arranged next to each other, and you're seeing the openings of those tubes, which are the pores. So how do we tell apart all these different boletes? It's quite tricky because we have dozens of different ones. Boletes, you have the tubes that are small and round. Swillus, you have larger, more angular tubes. Swillus are kind of slimy caps. They might have a ring on the stalk. Lexinum or scaber stalks you see here have kind of these black specks on the stem as well. So everyone wants to find the porcini, the king bolete, but we get kind of very excited and we want to find those, but there are many, many other boletes to get to know as well. Some are edible, some are not. There's a great website called the Bolete Filter, which is useful for helping to identify the boletes that you do find. So looking closely again will help you get to know these mushrooms. Now here is our true porcini, the Boletes edulis. It has a very characteristic wide base. And you may have to dig down to really see that, but it's highly prized as an edible in Europe and North America. It's a mycorrhizal species and quite famous. Okay, but it does look similar to many of the other boletes that we do have. The swillus, again, we have some that are kind of bright red that you might see around with larch, with hollow stems. You might see others with pine. Some of these are edible, but you want to remove the slime, kind of the slime layer from the caps before you eat them. So very meaty, and some of them are quite delicious as well. So again, just showing you kind of a snapshot of the diversity of mushrooms we have right here in Nova Scotia. And something that you might think is all the same could actually be multiple different species. You can also see the different life stages, right? The little baby mushrooms to the fully mature adults can look quite different. So to make a good collection, if you want to put it in a herbarium or submit a collection to our Mycoblitz, it's good to get many different life stages if you can, if they're present. So a few rules for boletes is to avoid the boletes with red or orange pore surfaces, avoid any of the bolete mushrooms that stain or bruise blue or green, avoid orange caplexinums, and with any edible mushroom, you only want to collect fresh young specimens. You never want to eat any wild mushroom raw as well. So mushroomexpert.com is another good resource to get to know for mushrooms in North America. Giant puffball, this is one of my favorites and one of the first ones that I learned as an edible because it's hard to mistake it for anything else. These literally contain trillions of spores when they're mature, but if you can get them when they're young, they're solid white all the way through. You can slice them up and cook them like French toast or in balsamic vinegar, and they're really delicious. They were used as styptics in the First World War to plug wounds and absorb bleeding, and just a really fascinating, hard to confuse with anything else type of mushroom you might see in your lawn at this time of year. That's Calvatia gigantea. And we have other puffballs too, of course. And of the woods are starting to come out, I'm happy to report. So check your living and dead oak trees, other hardwoods, stumps. And this is a good one to get to know because it's quite distinctive. These gray overlapping lobes and very meaty. Again, this is why it's called hen of the woods. Quite a delicious edible mushroom on hardwoods. It's typically grayish brown like this, and it's white on the inside. It's not the same as the chicken of the woods, which is also out right now, and this is Ladyporus sulphureus on living and dead oaks and hardwoods again, but it's really distinctive because it's bright orange, often with this yellow fresh edge. The kind of the youngest part is on the edge there, and that's the best part if you're going to be eating it. This one also smells a bit like apricots when it's fresh. So definitely check out these fungi. These are polypore mushrooms, so quite different than the other ones I've been showing you that had stems and grew out of the ground, out of wood. These ones, again, are these kind of overlapping brackets. There are many different polypores out there. Most are not toxic, but they just taste like wood. But there are a couple of really delicious ones, such as chicken of the woods and hen of the woods. Now, I mentioned we do have morels in Nova Scotia, not an abundance of them, but often seen in the spring in abandoned apple orchards or old forest fire sites, old burns, and some grow on bark mulch in cities and towns as well. And they're a good one to get to know because they're quite different. They're ascomycete fungi. They're in a whole different phylum than regular mushrooms, and they're producing spores all over the surface. So they don't have the gills and pores like the basidiomycete mushrooms. We have a few different species here. The black morel you might find in your garden mulch, really common in landscaped or mulched areas, or the yellow morel, which is found under apple trees, recently dead elms, and under poplars. And we haven't quite figured out how to cultivate a lot of these wild mushrooms, which is why they're so highly prized, because just like chanterelles, they have partners with trees, different relationships, and it's hard to mimic those and to produce these on a large scale. Now here's that false morel that I mentioned. Again, it often fruits at the same time. So early spring when people are just so excited to find some mushrooms, and it can be confused with morels, especially when they're young. It's under conifer trees, but it contains this toxin, gyromitrin, which basically is like consuming jet fuel, something you really don't want to do. And although it is removed by cooking, by boiling up these mushrooms, there have been cases where the chef has been poisoned by inhaling the fumes while the diners were okay to eat the mushrooms after they were boiled. So not recommended. And there's also evidence that there's a threshold effect that it can build up over time, and suddenly you can get really sick from eating the false morels. Okay, so again, showing you the difference up top, we have the yellow morel, more of a conical shape and hollow, and then we have the gyromitra, the false morel, which is more convoluted and not such a regular shape. They're on the bottom. So an example of getting to know the lookalikes when you're looking for edible mushrooms. Okay, you may see a lot of beautiful purple mushrooms out there right now. We have a big diversity of this one genus in Nova Scotia called Cortinarius, or the web caps. And they're called that because they have this webbing, this kind of veil under the cap that's protecting those developing gills and spores. And they come in all different colors, not just purple and brown, but really, really diverse genus. And some can be quite slimy, as you can see here. They always produce a dark kind of brownish spore print. And here's a closer view of that webbing that gives it the name Cortinarius, or the cortina, that is present only on this genus of mushrooms. Some of them are highly toxic, and they can have a very nasty toxin that has a long latency period. So you may not feel sick for days to weeks after consuming this mushroom. So do not eat any of the web caps because this toxin can also totally wipe out your kidneys and lead to death. So very serious toxin present in the Cortinarius. You can see they have common names like deadly Cortinarius, fool's webcap, little brown mushrooms in general. Good to avoid them, right? Because there's many, many different kinds. And we're getting in now to the most toxic of the mushrooms, and these are the some members of the genus Amanita. So you've probably heard of the death cap, Amanita phalloides, which contains amatoxins, which basically lead to stopping the production of certain proteins in our bodies. And interestingly, it does not affect the mushroom's own proteins, but it inhibits our human RNA polymerase. So we can't last too long without that in our body. We can't make the proper proteins for survival. And so even a square centimeter of this mushroom is enough to kill a grown adult. So you do not want to eat anything that looks remotely like this. You can see the swollen base, the cup shape, and the white ring on the stem. These are quite diagnostic. But there are other white amanitas in our woods as well, so it's best to avoid all of them in terms of edibility. And they're mycorrhizal with trees as well. So the liver is first targeted because it's attempting to remove the toxin from your body. If you consume this mushroom, it's going to affect your central nervous system and your kidneys. On day one, you might just feel like you have food poisoning, and you might not attribute it to eating a wild mushroom because it's kind of cramps and typical gastro symptoms. But the sneaky thing is, after about 3 days, you start to feel completely fine again. But what you don't realize is that at this time, the toxin is acting on your internal organs. So it's very, very diabolical, because by the time you start to realize that the liver and kidneys have been affected, day 4 or 5, it's too late, unless you have access to a liver transplant. So extremely potent toxin that can kill adults in 5 days if consumed. So one unfortunate instance how this has become a problem is that in certain parts of Asia, the paddy straw mushroom, Wolfville, is a common edible and looks quite similar to these white amanita mushrooms. It has the egg-shaped base, can have the ring on the stalk, but their spores are different in color. The paddy straw mushroom is a pink color. Amanita's spores are always white. So in this case, a spore print could literally save your life if you're interested in eating paddy straw mushrooms. Okay, and these mushrooms are actually spreading. The Amanita phalloides is considered an invasive mushroom, and it has been introduced several times to North America in different coastal areas and has spread north and south from its points of origin. So it's an introduced ectomycorrhizal fungus in North America, and it has native relatives here as well. Okay, so we more often will see Amanita biosporigera here, and this is very similar and just as dangerous as the death cap, the Amanita phalloides. So again, if you see anything like this, just avoid collecting it. Do not put it in your foraging basket. So we'll show you kind of the developmental stages, and you can see when it's young, it looks like a little white puffball. If you slice through it with a knife, you'll see the mushroom shape is present. A real puffball wouldn't have that, but you'll see a miniature mushroom in there. And you can see here also how it grows as it absorbs water after rainfall. It's rupturing that veil that kept it in the egg shape, which leaves those characteristic kind of polka dots of white, these veil remnants on the cap of the mushroom. Okay, so the ring or annulus is also present. That was that lower veil that was protecting the gills. And underground, you'd have to dig down to see that full base. We have another deadly mushroom, Galerina, the last one I'll talk about, but interestingly, it contains the exact same toxin as the white amanitas, even though it's a different genus. It looks completely different. It's only about 2 to 5 centimeters tall, has brown spores, but in its history, it has evolved the same toxin, which is extremely potent and deadly. Another reason to avoid the LBMs, or the little brown mushrooms. Okay, I did have one more to talk about. Sorry, I thought that was my final one, but you've probably seen the fly agaric around. It's another Amanita, Amanita muscaria. We have both yellow and red versions of this in Nova Scotia. It has different toxins, so not as deadly, not the amatoxins, but it does cause hallucinations and stomach upset. It's called the fly agaric because people used to cut up little bits of this mushroom, put it in a dish of milk in their kitchen. It would attract the house flies and they would become intoxicated and die. So it would be a little fly trap. This one has a history as a hallucinogenic substance called soma and is present in literature of different cultures, has long captivated people's imaginations. You might see these in big fairy rings growing around trees in your backyard. Not recommended as an edible. I can't forget the magic mushrooms as well. So these grow in coastal areas of North America, including Nova Scotia. And they have a different, it's considered a toxin, psilocybin, that is converted to psilocin once it's in the body. And that really acts like serotonin to our brains. So it's mimicking that neurotransmitter, serotonin, feel-good compound, and again, can cause gastrointestinal distress, but it does have this mode of action as a hallucinogen and serotonin mimic. As you can see here, map of it in the 1990s. Again, really likes the maritime coastal climate. So I mentioned how we have the different soil types here in Nova Scotia that mushrooms, lead to a diversity of mushrooms. We also have this very humid climate, which encourages mushrooms as well. So this group in particular, really only found in coastal areas. So some guidelines if you're getting into foraging, as many people are these days. Good field guide, don't eat any mushrooms with any features that contradict your descriptions that you've read about. When in doubt, throw it out. Don't eat any that are too young or too old. Take a note of the habitat that it's growing in and what it's growing on. Take a spore print, get to know the lookalikes, learn the deadly groups and the symptoms of mushroom poisonings. Avoid all the little brown mushrooms. They're really hard to identify. Never eat any mushroom growing from a sac or cup at the base because it's likely an amanita. Always cook your mushrooms well and just try a small amount of something new at first, keeping a sample with you as a reference. Okay, so in a few minutes here, I'll take some questions, but I wanted to touch on a few other aspects of fungi because we know that some are good to eat and some are poisonous, but there's more to them as well. And if you're interested in conservation, we've begun to work towards identifying which fungi are actually rare in Canada. And this is quite hard to figure out for mushrooms, as you can imagine. But we formed a virtual working group on this topic with members from government, from universities, from the public, from citizen scientists and students as well. And these are just folks that are really interested in finding out what habitats in Canada, should be preserved because of the presence of rare fungi and which fungi should we focus on. We narrowed it down to a target preliminary list as a starting point because we had to start somewhere, but there are many, many other fungi to consider as well. And so just some of them are pictured here. So these, you may not be likely to spot them in Nova Scotia, but they've maybe been seen in parts of Canada only a few times. Why are mushrooms so difficult to tally or to count? Well, for one thing, it's hard to even tell what an individual is with a fungus, right? Because you could see many mushrooms in an area that are actually all the same genetic individual. And fungal individuals underground, the mycelium, can literally be hectares in size. It can be really large. So that's a challenge. Then many fungi are ephemeral, meaning they're short-lived. They could be seasonal. They can be unpredictable, meaning some mushrooms don't come up every year. They might come up this year because we have had a lot of rain, for example, but they might not come up in a dry year. And sometimes we just don't know, why they appear one year and not the next. So it's hard to determine what true rarity is for a fungus, also versus just undersampling, because there are far fewer people out there collecting and studying fungi as compared to other groups of organisms. We know that fungi are under threat, just like everything else, with our global biodiversity crisis, from things like primarily habitat loss, but also climate change, pollution, nutrients, and eutrophication. So there's different approaches we can take to starting the conversation about mushroom conservation. We could take a habitat-based approach, focusing on unique habitats in Canada, such as old-growth forests and dunes. The habitats may be limited, and so understanding what habitats these species require is important. In many cases, we may be at the northern end of a range of a species. And then there are a few fungi that are endemic to Canada, meaning their entire range in the world is limited to Canada. And in that case, we actually have a conservation directive that we need to protect that species. So we've started with a plan. We had a recent publication about this, of how we can start to do assessments and work towards getting some species listed on what's called the red list, or getting conservation status assigned to different mushrooms. Okay, so we know that in Canada, there are groups for things such as plants and lichens, but there's no formal conservation or COSEWIC group just for mushrooms. So we can look at different ways that we can bring these to the attention of the governing body for making these decisions. So figuring out baseline information of which fungi are rare or threatened or of special concern. In most cases, we just don't have enough data to make that call yet, but things like the mycoblitz are helping us to fill in those gaps. And this is an area where we really need contributions, not only of trained mycologists such as myself, but also citizen scientists, naturalists, anyone who's out in the woods and paying attention to mushrooms, can help us with this project. So in Canada, our recent progress, there was a federal, the Canadian Wildlife Service, a wild species report that came out in 2020 that listed, as an attempt to document all the species in Canada, not just mushrooms, all the living species. And it was exciting to note that 7,000 different species of mushrooms, also called macrofungi, were assessed for this report. So we have a little bit of information about the range of these species and their occurrence, when they were seen and where. And you can actually search your favorite species online now through this wild species report. So it's quite an accomplishment. And from these, we identified about 228 species of mushrooms that may be at risk of extinction in Canada. And of these, 6 of these mushrooms have more than 75% of their total range in Canada. These wild species reports come out every 5 years. So currently, all species are being reassessed and will be published again in 2025. Including data for the Maritimes on mushrooms. And this data comes from places like herbaria and collections and provincial government records as well. So in our paper, we looked at using all available sources of data, including iNaturalist records, to try to figure out which fungi we should be focusing on. And it stressed the importance of building a strong network of anyone interested in fungi, professionals and amateurs, to develop resources, disseminate information, to make educated decisions and advance conservation actions. So our list of species is not definitive, but it's a starting point to start a larger conversation about this in Canada. And we know on the West Coast, for example, there's There's many rare species only found in old growth forests there, and they need our attention as well. So it's a big country and not that many people working on fungi, so we need your help. We have made some wanted posters. So we have things called a rare fungi challenge, where on iNaturalist, sometimes we do get records of very rare fungi popping up. So if we advertise what we're looking for, it helps naturalists, anyone out in the woods, to start to pay attention and document these fungi. So this one is called a pepper pot fungus. It's a really cool little earth star, kind of like a puffball, and it's now known from only 4 locations in Canada. The oldest collection dates back to 1896 and was spotted again in 2022 thanks to this poster. And it was actually found at Long Point in Ontario by a birder. So we're always looking for ways to engage the public in getting the word out about interesting mushrooms and conservation. That leads into our Mycoblitz this fall. So as I mentioned, we had one in August. The next one starts October 13th and runs through the 22nd. And if you're familiar with iNaturalist, you can join our project. If you're interested, you can check out the mycoda.com website for more information on this continent-wide initiative. You could also check out our Nova Scotia Mycological Society website for information about our upcoming October 14th foray near Canning. So that will be falling within our Mycoblitz dates. And we'll be having workshops on how to use iNaturalist and how to collect and dry these specimens if you want to contribute. And again, even just taking photos and adding them to the iNaturalist project, as long as they're photos from different angles showing underneath the cap of the mushroom, it's all really useful data for us, this project. Hey, so I could talk about mushrooms forever, but I have to wrap it up here so I can have some time for questions. But again, this is more links. This, I believe, is recorded as well. So if you want to refer back to any of this later, I've just provided some websites here with more information. And I have other slides as well about what's going on at Acadia, but I want to leave time for questions. So I'm just going to skip ahead to my thank you slide here, and happy to take any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much, Allison. That was really great. I have like a bunch of questions. I'm gonna try and start at the beginning and hopefully we can get through them. Ash Cameron says, what's the rarest edible mushroom to be foraged in Nova Scotia?
That's a great question. I would say morels are among the rarest because they are quite common in other places like Ontario and Quebec, but they're really not common here. So in terms of edible mushrooms that are well known, I think morel would be at the top of the list. Anyone else who's on the call, I know Ken Harrison is here, may feel free to disagree with me, but that one comes to mind.
Is there like a debate around it?
There may be debates. I didn't grow up in Nova Scotia, so I'm from Ontario. So I'm always open to learning new perspectives on, and of course, people don't want to share their mushroom spots where they find their favorite mushrooms, but they might share information on when to look for certain things or how common they might be.
Mm-hmm. I have a sort of question from Kevin Moore. So they're drying some mushrooms and they're wondering if they should take it to the Nova Scotia Museum or if it would be easier for them to drop it off at Acadia.
Yeah, thank you. It's really up to them on what's most convenient for them because we're happy to accept them at either location throughout the fall. So Sean Hoyen is our contact at the Nova Scotia Museum, or myself here. Either way, we can take them in the mail, or if you're in town and want to drop them off, it's all good.
They're also wondering if they handle dry mushrooms, if it'll leave traces.
That's a good question. It should be fine. We just use a tiny amount for the DNA sequencing. And so for this project, if you're drying them, you can use a food dehydrator. Oops, lights just went off in the building. Or if it's a small mushroom, just in an open paper bag until it dries out. And then we're asking that when they are completely dried to put them into a Ziploc bag, and that kind of minimizes the handling that goes on and keeps them safe.
Awesome. Another question here. The blusher is mostly edible in Europe. Is it the same in Nova Scotia?
So I would not recommend eating it here. For example, like my grandparents' generation in Canada and field guides from that era would have European names and would talk about edibility. But what we're learning now is that things that look like the European relatives are quite different here. And so if you go to our Nova Scotia Mycological Society website, you will see some good books and resources. I don't know if you can see this one here by George Barron. It's quite good for our area. Yep, so this probably it's a little blurry, but I can also provide a list of folks that are interested. But having a good up-to-date field guide for this part of the world is super helpful.
David Patricken is wondering if you have any thoughts on the S. Simard's mother tree concept regarding the
Yes, and yes, thank you for bringing that up. And so this is a really hot topic right now. And so it's caused all of us mycologists to re-examine our own biases because kind of the media got captivated by this idea of trees helping one another through this network underground. And we all, I guess it was a little bit overstated based on the actual evidence of what we actually have. And so it's an opportunity for us to look at the data. There have been experiments looking at how trees can move nutrients from one tree to another through the mycorrhizal networks. But there have been some flaws in some of these experiments when you look a little bit more closely, and there could be alternative explanations for the results that they observed. And so, long story short, we need more data and more controlled experiments because it's easy to overgeneralize and to say, fungi are going to save the planet and fungi are helping trees, but it's more complex, of course, than that. So it's a great question, and it's a very hot topic right now.
I also have a question wondering if there's like a direct link to the Fall project for the
Yes, there is. And so I'll try to pop that in the chat here. Yeah, so I found there's the iNaturalist link to the project, and then there's the Mycota website. So it's based in the US. That's where they're doing the molecular work for this project. So I'm going to pop a couple of these into the chat. And I can also email you later if that helps.
Someone's wondering how they can transition from amateur to academic professional.
Yeah, that's a great question. And so I teach mycology at Acadia. There are a few universities in Canada that offer it. There's also an online mycology course that's great out of UVic in Victoria, and you can use that to study at your own pace. So basically connecting with someone who teaches mycology is the best way to find out what your options are for that. And also going out with the Nova Scotia Mycological Society because it contains many retired and active academics in the local community.
That sounds like a wonderful place to start for sure.
Yeah.
So are there any upcoming events and lessons about bolete identification?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And it's great to know the interest is out there. So we have our big foray, happens once a year, and that's coming up October 14th near Canning at Ross Creek Center for the Arts. And we haven't finalized the schedule, so certainly we could think about a bolete workshop there because they are a very tricky group. So thank you for that. We're also looking to do some more events in the HRM area during our Mycoblitz as well. So the best place to look is we have also a very active Facebook page for the Nova Scotia Mycological Society with over 1,000 members and our website. So those are the best places to look for upcoming events. We even have some experts that come in from New Brunswick, and they also offer their time and offer walks. So it's a Myco-Maritimes kind of thing is happening here. It's very exciting.
Okay, someone's wondering if chicken lips are edible.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a really funny looking mushroom. It's green and yellow. I've never eaten them. I don't think they would taste very good. So again, I'm not a full-time forager, but to me, they wouldn't be maybe as worthy of my time as chanterelles, which you get more bang for your buck. And I see a question about a jack-o'-lantern here as well.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, all the caps are gone. Yeah, definitely squirrels and chipmunks will eat them. And they will even take mushrooms to the treetops and hang them up and dry them for later, which is amazing. So if you're ever hiking around, just look up and you might see where the caps of those jack-o'-lanterns have gone. That would be my guess. Deer will also eat them.
Yeah, I've seen the squirrels in Shuby Park going off with mushroom caps.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so like with that, I think that's enough questions for you, but I'll post this on YouTube, and then I'm sure that you had your email and your website on there so people can reach out to you as well.
Great. I'll pop that back in here too, just for everyone's benefit. And thank you again so much to this wonderful audience and to you, Jess, for inviting me.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming, and I hope you have a wonderful night. And thanks to all our followers for coming out and watching.
Thank you, everyone. Take care. Stay fungal. See you.
Bye.
Bye.